Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm Chris James, your host. If you found yourself all wrapped up in that last show that we were playing before the show, you can find our archives at strangethings.podomatic.com or look us up on iTunes. You can hear the rest of that show later. Tonight, we're going to be talking about The End. This is Season 2, Episode number 34. As I was preparing my notes for tonight's show, I had the Weather Channel on, watching the path of Harvey as it came storming into the Texas coast. As usual, all the experts were yelling and screaming about how this was going to be the storm of the century. Dogs and cats living together and all those things. I was reminded of back in 1980 when I was living in Seabrook, Texas. This was before I joined the fire department. There was a hurricane coming into the Gulf Coast, and it was going to be a nasty horror show of a storm. They announced everyone should evacuate, and most folks did. See, Seabrook sits right on Galveston Bay. It's about 7 feet above sea level. I think at the time maybe 9,000 people were living there. About 8,800 of them left town, heading for higher ground. I had no place to go and no money to get there with, so I decided I'd stay and see what happened. Not much. It was quiet and calm as the hurricane turned and went into land someplace else, and it was little more than a tropical storm when it got there. People came back home very upset. They had spent time and money for nothing. There wasn't even any rain. All those experts had said the storm was going to beat the area up like no one's business. This was to have some bad ramifications later on. I joined the Seabrook Volunteer Fire Department, and I had the most fun a person can have while other people are having a very bad day. And then another storm was coming into the area. Once again, all the experts started saying it looked as bad as it could get. This was going to be the storm of the century again, even though the last one was more like a calm day than a calm day could be. Most people all remembered the fun they'd had sitting in traffic for days trying to evacuate the last time they'd been told to go. No one, with the exception of our mayor, left town. They all decided the weather folks were just talking to get on the news. And Alicia came in and wiped the face of the earth with our town. It was as bad as they said it was going to be. The storm surge was 14 feet high. And remember, Seabrook was only 7 feet above sea level. Oh, what fun. If you look at Seabrook from above, you'll see it sits north of Clear Creek, east of Taylor Bay, and south of Bayport Ship Channel. In other words, it's surrounded by water. As Alicia came in and pushed all that water ahead of it, Seabrook turned into an island, and the storm surge came in ahead of the storm. We were completely cut off from the rest of Harris County, and then the storm came in. The mayor called from Dallas and said maybe it was time to evacuate. Right in the middle of the storm. 150-mile-an-hour wind gusts combined with absolutely no place to go. All the fire department could do was sit and wait for the storm to pass. The next few days, we went around town, digging people out from houses and apartment buildings that had collapsed. There were whole sections of housing that had simply vanished. No one could say for sure if people had been in them or not. Now, some of these places, like the old surf and sail apartments, were literally picked up and then dropped with people still inside. Boats had been floated from the harbor into town, being deposited in weird places like the middle of parking lots or the highway. All the rain that had come down into Harris County had to flow right through Seabrook as it entered the Gulf. So, for about 2 days, we were an island. Thank God the Baptist Church brought in their storm response people. They set up right next door to the fire station, and we had food that didn't come out of a can. The Red Cross had sent all their resources to Galveston. Yesterday, I sat and watched the weather folks. They all said it was going to be a bad storm, and I had to think, they'd better be right, or the next storm no one is going to listen, and it will probably be a nasty one as well. Well, I see that this storm was a nasty one, and it's still storming in some parts of the state. All I can say is I know exactly what you folks are going through. I usually watch the Weather Channel, so I have a 50-50 chance of knowing what the weather's going to be. They were running a special report on all the nasty things that might befall our planet. Things like global warming, and a giant meteorite hitting the place, volcanoes erupting and causing global cooling. There just might be a giant tsunami hit California and wipe out the entire left coast. I understand they want to grab some headlines to increase their viewership, but maybe they should take note of some of the predictions from the past before declaring they know the future. As I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, as some folks say I still have a ways to go, everything seemed to center on the Soviet Union trying to destroy the United States. During class, we would be taught to duck and cover in the event of a nuclear bomb going off anywhere within the city limits. They'd wheel in the projector and pull down the screen, and they'd show us one of several short news clips. Something like this.
This is basic civil defense information from the Department of Defense, Office of Civil Defense, Washington. If the United States should be attacked with nuclear weapons, it's almost certain that our networks of warning stations would detect incoming bombers or missiles in time for you to reach shelter or at least take cover. You may receive warning of an attack by radio, television, or through the outdoor warning system in your community. It's important that you learn to recognize the attack warning signal and not confuse it with any other. In most places, the standard attack warning signal is a 3 to 5 minute wavering sound or a series of short blasts on whistles, horns, or other devices. Either of these signals means that an actual enemy attack has been detected, and you should take protective action immediately. Find out from your local civil defense office the attack warning system that will be used in your community.
And they would show us these movies over and over, different times of the day, just about always the same message. On the roof of our school was an air raid siren, and they would test the siren on occasion. They'd blast that sucker, and that would tell us that it was all time for us to hide under our desks and pray that we survived. Yes, they would blast that sucker out over the neighborhood, and then we would all crawl under our desks and hope it was just a test. Keep in mind, we were kids. We didn't know if this was for real or not. I was maybe 10 at the time. I would sit there and look up at the underside of my desk and wonder if maybe some of that chewing gum stuck under there was still edible. Then the all clear would be announced and life would continue as if nothing had happened. Except, in the backs of our minds, we were all thinking, what if a bomb was to go off right now? With that pleasant thought, we're going to take a pause and play a couple commercials, so don't go away. We'll be right back after these messages. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio.
Are you?
Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. I have no idea where that came from. Coffee, nectar of the gods. And at the Organic Man Coffee Trike, you'll find coffee made the right way, one delicious cup at a time. Stop on by 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. Did you go out UFO hunting and couldn't focus on the sky? You need to go to Del Norte Optical at 107 Calle del Norte and go have your vision fixed. That's not a UFO, that's a weather balloon.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. Any of you all out there who are podcasters will understand what I'm saying when I say that my soundboard is evil. I think it's possessed. Getting back to the show, I'd seen images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They both were pretty much Kaputski. I would sit there in class thinking how would I ever find my way home if those nasty commies ever did drop a bomb on us. This made paying attention just a tiny bit difficult. What good would knowing how to do the new math ever help me to survive? Just about everybody hated the new math. My mother was no exception. She took one look at my homework assignments and called the school asking, what the heck was this supposed to be? The new terminology, the sets, unions, intersections, it was all cattywampus. If she couldn't understand it, how on earth was I going to be able to understand? They said it was essential for me to learn this stuff if I ever wanted to graduate, and that was it. No reason for it, you just had to know it. It was just a stepping stone towards getting out of school with a piece of paper that said you knew stuff. Sometime in the middle 70s, the new math was done away with, and the newer math took its place. The newer math was just the old math mixed in with the new math. Things just kept getting more confusing for the students, and people wondered why kids didn't know anything. Now, things like regrouping was used in place of addition and subtraction. It wasn't good enough to know what 6 times 7 was. You had to show how you came up with 42. I was lucky to survive school with most of my senses still working. I was even so bold as to ask my teacher when and where would I ever use any of this stuff? I knew how to add and subtract, but I could not say why it was that way, using the terminology they wanted to hear. I was told I had to know it in order to graduate, and that was that. I was far more focused on thinking about survival than these idiotic new terms. And getting back to the end of the world, I somehow managed to squeeze through the cracks and find myself in high school. The building was classified as a fallout shelter because it had a basement. Every nook and cranny was packed full of civil defense boxes. The areas under the stairs had been fenced off, and piles of boxes could be seen secured down there in the dark. This took care of what we were going to eat and drink. I now began to wonder how we would survive the blast. Our high school was about 2 miles from a major Air Force base. I figured the commies would probably miss the air base and hit our school. But that would solve the problem of where we're going to sleep or take a bath. All through high school, I had to endure that god-awful siren and all those duck and cover drills. The Soviet Union crumbled away, and the world never did end as I had been told it was going to happen. People have been predicting the end of the world for as long as there have been people predicting things. As 63 B.C., Roman troops moved into the land belonging to the Jews, and they took over. The Romans had one major concern, keeping their own country happy by taking as much from their conquests as they could carry. By 66 A.D., the last Roman procurator, or Roman governor, Florus, stole piles of silver from the temple. Now this was just too much. He was stealing from God's house. The Jewish masses rioted, and they wiped out a small Roman garrison stationed in Jerusalem. Cestius Gallus, the Roman ruler in neighboring Syria, sent in a large force of soldiers to put down these riots. These soldiers would have been made up mostly of Syrian people with Roman commanders. The Jewish insurgents, having a victory under their belt, routed these troops as well. The Romans didn't much like the taste of defeat, so they put together a bigger army, 60,000 heavily armed and highly professional troops, mostly hardened Roman soldiers. They launched their first attack against the Jewish state's most radicalized area, Galilee in the north. The Romans vanquished Galilee, and an estimated 100,000 Jews were either killed or taken prisoner and sold into slavery. As Roman army was busy destroying Galilee, the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem did almost nothing to help their fellow Jewish community. The thought was the uprising was doomed, and they didn't want to get killed as well. The refugees who succeeded in escaping from Galilee fled to the last major Jewish stronghold, Jerusalem. Once they were safely inside the walled city, they killed everyone in the Jewish leadership who was not as radical as them. All the level-headed moderate Jewish leaders who might have saved Jerusalem were killed by their fellow Jews who didn't think they were radical enough to lead their fellow citizens. As the Roman army, was surrounding the walled city and they began their siege, the radicals inside were still busy rounding up anyone who didn't agree with them and killing them. This was as close to a suicidal civil war as you could get. The people living in Jerusalem had been stockpiling food for just such an event. They had plenty of dry goods to last out just about any siege. The crazed radicals burned the food supply in a misguided effort to get the entire Jewish population to join the uprising. They had hoped this giant battle between the Jews and the Romans would bring about the end of the current world and usher in the Messiah. Not Jesus, but another one. They were so convinced that they would win, they had coins minted in celebration of their victory. Once just about half the fighting force inside Jerusalem had been killed at the hands of their own people, their entire food supply was gone, the Romans waltzed in and killed or captured the entire city. The Romans burned the temple to the ground in order to get the gold that had been encased in. So, in a bizarre kind of way, they had been right. It was the end of the world for just about everyone living in Jerusalem back in 70 AD. From 375 to 400, Martin of Tours, the French bishop, stated that the world would end before 400 AD. He wrote, "There is no doubt that the Antichrist has already been born. Firmly established already in his early years, he will, after reaching maturity, achieve a supreme power." The Antichrist was supposed to show up just about every year from the time Jesus was born up until today. In 500 AD, Sextus Julius Africanus, Hippolytus of Rome, and Irenaeus all predicted the return of Jesus and the end of the current world. The continent of Africa was not named for Sextus Julius Africanus. The continent was named after Scipio Africanus, who was a Roman general and a statesman of the Roman Empire. Scipio Africanus was an Edomite. That's an area just south of the Dead Sea. The entire continent of Africa had been called Ethiopia at one time, but was changed after the Roman general Scipio Africanus had conquered one small area. The Sextus Africanus, on the other hand, predicted that Jesus would return in the year 500 based on the dimensions of the ark. Somehow you took the length, timed the width, and I guess you divided by your shoe size, and somehow you came up with the date. Needless to say, the world did not end in 500 AD. In 990, church leaders discovered the dates of significant holidays would happen on the same day in 992. This led church leaders to announce the end of the world was here. In 992 AD, Good Friday coincided with the Feast of Annunciation. This had long been believed to be the event that would bring forth the Antichrist, and thus the end of times within 3 years. People were all preparing for the world to end and a great battle to ensue between Jesus and his army and the soldiers of Satan. I'm not sure how you'd prepare for such a thing, but they did try. Laying in a supply of food, and maybe getting a sword or a spear sharpened. I'm sure the people were especially careful to pray as much as possible and not miss any gatherings at church. The closer the final day became, the harder they would have worked at securing their place on the winning side. I hate to think what might have happened the years immediately following the non-event. I'm sure some folks lost all belief in what their religious leaders had been saying. Joachim of Fiore, the Italian mystic, determined that the new millennium, or the end of the world, would arrive in 1260. His followers were called Jacobites. When 1260 had come and gone, he tried again. He used his vast mystical abilities to predict the year 1290. When that day passed, with not so much as a good earthquake, he tried another date, 1335. I hope his followers weren't too vociferous when telling their neighbors that the end was near. It kind of reminds me of a guy named Harold Camping, but we'll get to him soon. Despite his best efforts, the world had just kept spinning and life went on. In 1524, a group of London astrologers predicted the world would end by a giant flood, starting in London, despite what the Bible says about any more giant floods. 2,000 Londoners packed their bags and they left their homes. They were all looking for higher ground to save them from the coming catastrophe. 1585, the Spanish-born reformer Michael Servetus announced in his book, The Restoration of Christianity, the devil's reign had begun in 325 A.D., at the time of the Council of Nicaea. You might have heard of this. It was the time the books of the Bible were decided on. Servetus did some math, and he came up with the date of 1585. The devil was supposed to have 1,260 years to do his nastiness, and then the world would end, and Jesus would come and take all the faithful up to heaven. Servetus was more than just a theologian. He was also a medical practitioner. He had figured out how blood flowed into the lungs in order to get from one side of the heart to the other. Until this time, people all believed that the blood magically moved from the right side of the heart to the left side, and that was that. Servetus was one of those folks who knew a lot about things, but he didn't seem to have the ability to keep it from upsetting other people. A jealous physician ambushed and tried to kill him. A sword fight broke out, and Servetus defended himself, injuring one of his attackers. Due to the weird laws in those times, he wound up in jail for a while. No such thing as the right to defend yourself in those days. 1553, Servetus wrote a book saying that predestination was a myth. And this managed to piss off his former associate Calvin, who was writing a book on how predestination was a fact. Well, Calvin had some friends high up in the church, and he claimed that Servetus was a heretic. And Servetus had to flee to Vienna. A really close friend of Calvin got himself into trouble, and in order to survive the Inquisition, this friend claimed that Servetus was the one who was guilty. So the authorities burned Servetus at the stake. The world did end in 1585, but in 1553, at least Servetus's world did. Then a bunch of London astrologers, who had forgotten about the last bunch of London astrologers who had screwed up back in 1524, decided to announce the world was going to end on February 1st, 1624. They got busy telling everyone they knew what they were talking about because they could read the stars. You know the old saying, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. The world just kept going, despite their best wishes to the contrary. And now it's time for some commercials and a couple of cups of coffee, so don't go away. We'll be right back after these important messages. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019.
Back in 1776, one of our founding fathers said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel about your coffee, you need to go buy the Organic Man Coffee Trike and have a cup of the best coffee on the world. 4501 McPherson, number 9. And remember, life is way too short for drinking bad coffee.
If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte. just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanelza Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanelza Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. Even Christopher Columbus had to get involved with the whole "the world is going to end" scene. He came out with his math solution, saying the world was built in the year 5343 BC. He didn't know about Slarty-Bartfast. If you've never heard of Slarty-Bartfast, you need to check out The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Back to Columbus. He declared the world was going to last 7,000 years because, well, that's how long worlds would last. This meant the world was going to end in the year 1658, long after Columbus would be in the grave. This would give his great-grandkids something to worry about. John Napier, the mathematician, calculated the end of the world would be in 1688, based on calculations from the Book of Revelations. Remember the Salem witch hunts? 1689, Cotton Mather had a great deal to do with using spectral evidence against the accused witches and denying any natural cause could be to blame. His vastly advanced knowledge was used to convict anyone accused of being a witch. Long after the accused were dead and buried in unmarked graves, Cotton came out with a book claiming he had opposed the trials, when in fact he had been very much part of the conviction process. After helping convict a bunch of people who were mostly not guilty, he went on to make a prediction. The world was going to end in 1697. When the magic date came and went, he quickly announced the world would actually end in 1760, based on his vastly advanced knowledge. This end of the world date didn't happen any more than the first one, so he used that fantastic learning he possessed to say the world would end in 1736 for sure. Absolutely sure this time. I wonder if he would have been very disappointed when the world just kept on going, despite his vast advanced knowledge. Mather had died in 1728, so he didn't get to face the music about all of his failed predictions. Now, some of y'all will recognize the name George Van Tassel. If not, he was born in Ohio in 1910. He grew up and graduated high school at 16. And then he got busy working and learning. He got involved in the aircraft industry. While working, he met up with a man named Frank Kritzer, who was an eccentric individual who was working a mine near the Giant Rock. The Giant Rock is a large freestanding boulder in the Mojave Desert, right adjacent to Landers, California. It covers 5,800 square feet of ground, and it's 7 stories high. The Giant Rock is supposed to be the largest freestanding boulder in the world. Frank had dug down under the rock, and he'd built his home down there. In 1942, Frank came on the radar of the local authorities, who suspected him of being a Nazi spy. A gun battle broke out, and Frank was killed. George Van Tassel moved his wife and 3 daughters into the underground home, and he began to develop the area around it. He fixed up an old airfield, built a dude ranch, and a cafe. George started hosting group meditation back in the 50s in a room underneath the Giant Rock. Van Tassel believed the rock's crystalline structure possessed great channeling power by virtue of its piezoelectric characteristics. The group were trying to make contact with beings from other planets. On August 21st, 1953, a ship from Venus landed at the airstrip, and a man wearing a jumpsuit announced, "I am Salgada. I would be pleased to show you my craft." Van Tassel said he was taken aboard a hovering spaceship, and then he was given a tour of the ship and told that he had been chosen to bring a message of peace and interplanetary brotherhood to his fellow Earthlings. The alien showed Van Tassel a diagram of a structure that he was to build. The construction was to be done without using any screws or nails. Everything was going to be held together using wooden pegs. The Integratron was to be used to rejuvenate anybody who spent time inside. And then the alien took George on a tour of the galaxy. The alien sent a warning to everybody living on Earth. The atomic bomb had been a bad thing. It should never have been built. If the people of Earth kept messing about building atomic weapons, the entire Earth would be destroyed when the United States exploded their first hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen would cause every living thing to die. Van Tassel got busy telling the world that the aliens had said, "Stop building nuclear weapons." Well, this brought the attention of the FBI, who began to show up and listen in on all the UFO and abductee conferences. Any time a group was gathered near the giant rock, the feds were there keeping tabs on everyone. People interested in UFOs were considered to be close to being communists. George said the aliens had told him that the southern half of the United States was going to be liquidated by the Soviet Union during a sneak attack against the U.S. on August 20th, 1967. George said he got this information by channeling an alien named Ashtar. George died February 9th, 1978. The Integratron was finished by one of his daughters. People visiting it say they do feel much more revitalized after spending time inside. Have you ever heard the expression, "Don't drink the Kool-Aid"? You ever wonder where it comes from? Jim Jones was the founder of the People's Temple back in 1955. Jones was a charismatic preacher who didn't mind using a bit of deception in order to spread the Word of God, at least his interpretation of it. Members of this new church were encouraged to give everything they had to the temple in order to help spread the Word. The church would then see to it that the members had everything they needed. The church would also decide what the members did indeed need. The People's Temple was integrated during a time when segregation was the norm. This drew a lot of unwanted attention. Jones finally moved the church from Indiana to California in a bid to escape the scrutiny of the authorities. The temple soon got involved in politics. All Jones had to do was say the word, and all the members would vote for whichever candidate he liked. This began to draw more attention, since as a non-profit organization, they were forbidden from political activities. While on a trip to Georgetown, Guyana, Jones looked at the dense jungle around the area, and he decided this would make a great place to reestablish the temple, well away from the scrutiny of the U.S. and safe from the coming atomic war with the USSR. He established the People's Temple Agricultural Project, which was better known as Jonestown, in the jungle outside of Port Katuma. There was an old airstrip there that was to be used to bring in the supplies as well as the members. The official story was the place was a socialist dream. Everyone was happy there, and they shared in everything. It was a garden paradise in the jungle. The things were not as claimed. There was considerable nastiness in Utopia. Members were still receiving their welfare checks, which they had to sign over to the temple. They worked long hours to keep the place going. And soon there were too many people crowded into too little area. Jones was supposed to have healed many members who were sick with various diseases. These people soon began to die from the same diseases he had said he had cured. Any insurance checks had already been signed over to the temple as well. A group of disillusioned members snuck out through the barbed wire fence one night. The fence was supposed to be there to keep animals out, but in fact it was there to keep people in. They told their stories to Leo Ryan, who represented California's 11th Congressional District. Ryan became concerned with the health and well-being of his constituents who were now living in Guyana. November 1978, Ryan and an entourage flew to Guyana to meet with the People's Temple and see if any of these stories were true. As they talked to members of the temple, soon a large group were asking to be taken back to the United States. The congressman and his associates, along with 14 temple members, returned to the airstrip, planning to fly back home. The Red Brigade, the temple security, attacked the airstrip, shooting as many people there as they could. The congressman and 4 others were killed. The shooting was caught on videotape by one of the reporters who died during the attack. Back in Utopia, it was announced that the end of the world had arrived. Huge tanks filled with poisoned Flavor Aid, not Kool-Aid, were set up in the commissary, and people lined up to kill themselves. Children were helped by having the poison sprayed into their mouths. 909 people committed mass suicide, 304 of whom were children. They killed themselves to avoid the coming apocalypse between the United States and the Soviet Union. Jim Jones, the founder of the People's Temple, has stated that he'd had a vision that a nuclear holocaust was going to end the world, so they took their own lives in order to avoid dying in the coming nuclear war. The expression, "don't drink the Kool-Aid," lives on even though it was Flavor Aid that was used. I remember when this happened. I saw it on the news, and I thought about all those people I had met who were members of the temple. They would go around preaching about how wonderful the world was going to be. Charles Manson predicted that the apocalyptic race war would occur in 1969. He also figured the races wouldn't get the war kicked off without his help. That's why he had dispatched his minions to kill people as a way of showing how to start the war. Once the war was over, he planned to step in and take over to become the leader of the United States. Everyone was supposed to assume a particular group had committed this crime. Charles Manson is still sitting in jail today. And now for Harold Camping. Harold Camping must have used Cotton Mather as his role model. And not the witch hunting part, but the prediction part. Camping declared the world was going to end, and him and his followers would be spirited away to heaven. The big date was September 6th, 1994. All of his followers prepared by the big day by quitting their jobs, selling anything they didn't need after the 6th, and spending all of their money. When the 6th rolled around and everybody was still here, a herald came out and said, "Oh, it was the 29th." They just had to hang on for 23 days. Too bad most of them didn't have a home or any money. Once they were in heaven, everything would be great. And once again, we're going to take a brief pause, play a couple of commercials, and drink some coffee. So don't go away. We'll be right back after these important messages. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019.
Looking for a great cup of coffee, but you just don't know where to find one? Stop on by the Organic Man Coffee Truck, 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. Tell Julio or Marta you want some of the best coffee on earth. Remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9.
Did you go out UFO hunting and couldn't focus on the sky? You need to go to Del Norte Optical at 107 Calle del Norte and go have your vision fixed. That's not a UFO, that's a weather balloon.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show once more. Getting back to Harold Camping and his followers. Once more, the followers found themselves looking for new jobs and places to live. Old Harold did some more calculating, and he came out with a new date. October 2nd, 1995. He said he'd made a tiny mistake in his math, and this was going to be the big event for sure. Once more, his followers were disappointed to find they had not been raptured and whisked away to heaven, but they were still stuck here on earth, which had failed to be destroyed. Mr. Camping got out his calculator and his Bible, and he got busy one more time mashing the numbers and trying to find the magic date. And then he found it. He'd forgotten to carry the 10 or something. Maybe it was all that new math that was confusing him. This time he knew he had it right. May 21st, 2011, the world was going to end, and his faithful, the ones that were still listening to him, were all going to meet up in heaven. It must have been back in 1582 when everybody switched to the Gregorian calendar and dates got mixed up a bit. This could explain why Harold messed up this time. He came out saying it was actually October 21st, 2011. Once more, all of his followers ran out and quit their jobs. They sold their homes and went on a kind of a Mardi Gras party spree, expecting to wake up on October 22nd in heaven, maybe with a bit of a hangover, but they would have escaped the coming destruction of the world. The word gullible comes to mind when I think about all those camping followers who found themselves once more out of a job with no home and no money. Harold died on December 15th, 2013, without making any new end-of-the-world predictions. Or maybe he did, but nobody listened. Some folks need somebody to tell them what to do and when to do it. These are the folks who gravitate to cults as a means of going through life without all the bother of having to make decisions for themselves. Marshall Applewhite had lots of followers who were willing to do anything he said. Things like, "You don't need those testicles, so go get 'em removed." All the male followers rushed out and had their dangly bits cut off. Less baggage to take into outer space. Marshall began calling his cult the Heaven's Gate. The plan was to escape from the coming destruction of the planet by hitching a ride on a passing spaceship, just like in the Hitcher's Guide. The main difference was, instead of using an electronic thumb, they would all kill themselves, and this would enable their spirits to hop on board the passing ship. Just hope it wasn't going to be the Vogons. March 26th, 1997, 39 Heaven's Gate members committed suicide so they could join all their other members who had already died and been taken on board this passing ship. Nostradamus wrote that in 1999, the world just might end. In one of his quatrains, which was his code to avoid being burned at the stake, he said, "The King of Terror would come from the sky in 1999 and 7 months." This was frequently interpreted as the prediction of doomsday in July 1999. Nostradamus lived back in the 1500s, and he used scrying to make his predictions. You can either use a mirror or a bowl of water, set it on a very stable table. No wobbling or wiggling. Then you sit in a darkened room, and you glance across the reflective surface and see what there is. This can be used for predicting the future or for making contact with spirits. Now, some of Nostradamus' predictions were very accurate, and some were just confusing. He wrote in Old French, which is a bit confusing to begin with. Then he used his secret code so the Inquisition would not be able to read his writings and use them against him. The nasty, noisy, negative naysayers will focus on some of his mistakes, like the use of the name Hister instead of Hitler. They will completely ignore the parts where Nostradamus was correct, as in, he would reign over Greater Germany, and bloody will his reign be. Even though Nostradamus didn't get the end of the world correct, I still give him a thumbs up on some of his predictions. The Y2K disaster, 1999 to the year 2000. I remember it well. The so-called experts were all saying all of our computers were going to crash. Since most of the modern world runs on computers these days, this was going to bring our world crashing to a halt. Maybe not the end of the world, but the end of society. Jerry Falwell foresaw God pouring out his judgment on the world on this day. Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins, two religious authors, stated that the Y2K bug would trigger global economic chaos, which the Antichrist would use to rise to power. The people began to lay in stockpiles of food. Some drew all their money out of the banks. There was a group of folks who bought a mountain, and they began moving all of their possessions there in preparation of the coming disaster. Gun sales were very good that time. I was sent on a recruiting trip on December 28th. Once I touched down in Northeast, I was told I might not be making it back home if the airlines all shut down due to their computers all locking up. It was snowing and it was cold, and I really didn't want to spend New Year's Eve in a hotel. The whole trip was a disaster as far as recruiting went. Our flight into Dallas had problems with the landing gear, and we had to circle the airport until there was no fuel left, and we had no choice but to land. The airline lost our display, so we weren't able to have a Border Patrol recruiting display set up. The hotel gave us faulty directions on how to get there. And in 2 days of work, we signed up maybe 10 people. Fortunately, we did get back to Laredo on the 31st. We got together and had a good old time on the 31st. I got up the next morning and found all the computers and the electronics had survived with not even a slight problem. There was just one more prediction that amounted to nothing. Now, this one has got to be my favorite end-of-the-world prediction because so much was made out of it. I'm talking about December 21st, 2012, the all-encompassing Mayan death calendar foretold for thousands of years. I used to listen to Coast AM all the time. I recorded it when I wasn't able to listen at night. It seemed to me just about every week some guest was proclaiming the world was going to end in 2012. Of course, they all had books they wanted to sell, but that's how you make a living. These experts had all been studying the Mayan calendars, and they all knew this was going to be the big one. It was time to buy piles of gold, as if you could eat gold once there was no food around. You were to stockpile food from all of the survival food companies, and you could put it on your credit card. I would have been a lot more impressed by these companies had they said cash only or ATMs. Once more, gun sales were on the rise. There were going to be riots in the streets. All those people who had bought gold would now be at the mercy of those folks who had invested in lead, as in bullets. Movies came out showing unreal actions during the end. Things like cell phones still working long after the power went out. Being able to fix a car by swapping out the engine's computer. Just typical Hollywood nonsense. My sister-in-law, Rosario, was having her birthday on the 21st, so we got together to celebrate what just might be her last birthday. Well, I'm sure you all know the world didn't end December 21st, 2012. The only thing close to the end of the world was our favorite coffee shop, Scholars, closed. That was as close to the end as we should ever get. Good thing we now have the Organic Man coffee trike to fulfill all of our caffeine needs. As for all of those people that were writing all those books and appearing on the radio show telling how the Mayans had said this was the end and other things about how the world was doomed, you don't hear much out of them anymore. They kind of burned all their bridges by being so adamant about how they knew what the Mayans were thinking when they carved the last calendar in stone, no less. So I'll end with a few words of advice. Should you suddenly discover you know when the world is going to come crashing into nothing, if you had a dream or you get a message in your sleep, maybe you should grab your Bible and read what Jesus had to say about the end times in Matthew 24, 35 through 37. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words shall not pass away. But of the day and the hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. Next time some TV evangelist starts telling you he knows when the end of the earth will be, ask yourself, why would God tell him if he didn't even bother to tell his own Son? If you want some good ideas for the next big event, I suggest you read Cody Lundine's book, When All Hell Breaks Loose. It has some really great information you can use if you get caught in a hurricane or say the power goes out for a few days. This is not your typical end-of-the-world scenario book. It's a book that everybody should read simply because it has some fantastic information. Things like what to do if you can't drink the water, or what happens if you should have to defend yourself and you now have a dead body laying out on your front lawn, really good, really in-depth reading. If you recognize the name Cody Lundin, he was the guy from Dual Survival. The barefoot, hippie-looking guy who always seemed to know exactly what to do in any bad situation. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. Oh, and as for the book, When All Hell Breaks Loose, I will try to put a link to it on our Facebook page, Strange Things with Chris James, so you can find it that way much easier. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell your friends to listen in. You can now find us on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, TuneIn, Podomatic, and Podcast Junkie, just to name a few. Till next week, this is Chris James.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?